Hello everyone and welcome to recap session number 2. My name is Bruce and today we are going to be covering the basics of HTML and we might get into a little CSS, depends on how well it's going. So we're going to cover basically what HTML is, what it stands for, what it does, how it's used, and some of the basic principles that you need to know in order to work with the language. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the basics of HTML. So, whoops, sorry. Alright, so essentially, let's talk a little bit about the things that you're going to need, at least for this class. So you're not going to need too much. We're going to be using an IDE, which is not exactly required, but it does make things a lot easier and a lot nicer to work with, especially when you're working with HTML and such. So we're going to use the IDE. Now, like we talked about in class, every one of these acronyms has a specific letter you want to look for. In the case of IDE, it's the E at the end, which stands for environment. So you want to think of a coding environment that helps you makes your code easier to read and easier to work with. Helps to fill in some blanks where you might have some questions, and it tries to help you out with your coding. So Sublime is the one we're going to be using. You can use pretty much whatever you want, but that's what we're going to be using for this class. So you can go ahead and download that. Then you can go to these two links, which would be really, really great. Okay, so I would highly recommend looking them looking at them. They're going to help you a lot through this month. They're going to show you pretty much everything we're going to work through. And if you have questions, they're a really great resource. Alright, so HTML, what and why? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Now you don't have to memorize that whole thing, but essentially what you want to memorize here is this text markup part right here. And of course language. So it's a text markup language. This hyper is just kind of added on there. So essentially HTML is going to structure your text on the page, and it's also going to mark it up. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So HTML is used to create websites, in case you haven't picked that up already. So at the end of this month, you will all have made your own website, and that's actually a part of the homework. Hopefully by now you have been given the homework. If not, stop watching this, send me an email, and ask me to send it to you. It is crucial that you have the homework by this point. Okay, so let's talk about something that is extremely important if you want to do anything with HTML, and that is the HTML skeleton. So we're going to talk about all this in a minute, but just know that this is the skeleton of every single web page out there. You can't have HTML, you can't have a website without pretty much all of this. Now this head section, this here, and this here you don't necessarily need, but this, and this you definitely need. Okay, the doc type HTML, body, and the end HTML. So we're going to talk about all those different things in a second, but just know that this is required for a website to work. Okay, so you've been seeing these greater than, less than signs all over the place. Well, what are they exactly? So they're actually called tags. So every HTML element that you'll ever see has a start and an end tag. Now that's not exactly true, but every HTML element is going to have at least this one here. Some of them, most of them, will have this end. But for now, pretty much for as far as you're concerned, all HTML elements will have this end, at least with what we're going to be working with this semester. When you get into the advanced class, we'll be working with more advanced tags that don't necessarily have this end tag to them. But just know for now that every tag you work with must have this beginning tag and this end tag. And I'm going to reference that as all one tag. So these both together and whatever is in between, that's one tag. So whenever I say a tag, that's pretty much what I mean, unless I specify beginning tag or end tag. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we can use these tags now that we know pretty much what tags are. So what we're going to be talking about are headers. Okay, so essentially headers are a form of tags, and they're actually an element, and they essentially make the text on your page take precedence, or they make your text like a title or a subtitle, something like this. So we have a big title that says breaking news. Then we have a fairly less important subtitle that says a villager has failed to report his library book on time. So as you can see, this H1 is the more important header, it being the main idea, the main title, which is breaking news, wants to get your attention. And then we have our H2, which kind of explains our H1, so it's a little less important than this H1. So when you think about headers, that's what you want to think about, a level of importance. There are 6 different types or layers of headers. They are written like H1, H2, and all the way to H6, with the number being the only thing that you change. So it's still H, but then the number after that changes. So headers are used primarily for formatting websites. The size of them is only the default setting of the browser. So if we go back to the previous slide, and we see that our H1 is bigger than our H2, that doesn't have to be that way. We can use a programming language called CSS to change that so that our H1 is actually smaller than our H2. So you don't want to think of the headers as a size per se. They're just displayed like that as the default setting of the browser. So the browser by default will set your H1s bigger than your H2s, but that can all be changed. What you want to think of the headers as not big text, but as importance, level of importance, and we're going to talk about that in a second. So let's talk a little bit about that level of importance I talked about, and in HTML that is called semantics, or formatting, or hierarchy. All of those words mean pretty much the same thing. We have our really important thing here. We have the thing that's kind of important, which is a little less than this, and then we have just important, which is underneath of this, and then we have not quite as important. So as you can see, the really important things are going to be H1s, less importance are H2s, and so on down the line. That's how those headers will work, not by size, but by level of importance. We have the king, the bishop, the knight, and the peasant. So as you can see, our peasant is less important, obviously, than the king. So we're not going to make our peasant an H1 just because we want it to be big. If we did want our peasant to be big, we could use CSS to make our H4s bigger than our H1s in size, not semantically. So you are actually surprisingly well on your way to make websites. So you get the basics of HTML now, hopefully. And every HTML that you've ever seen, or ever will see for that matter, runs on HTML. Every website you've seen runs on what you've learned so far. So now you can actually create the basic skeleton used in every single website that was ever made. All these websites were all created using HTML. What we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're actually going to talk about that HTML skeleton now that you have a bit of a better idea what's going on. As you can see, we have our start tag, start HTML, and we have our end tag. That's with the slash, so that is an end. Then we have our start head and our end head, our start body, and our end body. That's how you want to think of these tags, okay? If they have that slash in front of them, that means it's an end. So we have 3 ends, 1, 2, 3, because of that slash. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 beginning heads, or beginning tags, I'm sorry. Now you'll notice this one up at the top does not have an end tag. This is one of those advanced tags that does not have an end tag. Okay, so don't let that throw you. Just remember that every single tag has to have an end, except this guy. Don't worry about that. Okay, don't let that confuse you. Now, we're not going to worry about our head so much because we're not going to be putting any code in there. It's in between our start body and our end body that we're going to worry about. And in the next recap session, I'm actually going to get into some coding, and we're going to talk about how to do this. So just get the idea of our main code is going to go inside of our body. So that's what you want to get out of this skeleton. So now we're going to skip back to where we were before. And by this point, you guys should have the handout with the skeleton on it. So hopefully that will jog your memory if you're a little bit confused or whatnot. So let's get into that programming language that I mentioned before, which is CSS. Now, if you're confused at this point, stop the video, go back and re-watch what you've watched to this point, because CSS can get a little confusing. None of the rules we've learned so far, pretty much none of them apply to what we're about to learn. So please don't watch this. If you're still confused, go back and watch the HTML segment that we just talked about. Otherwise, let's get into CSS. So, CSS is a language that's used hand in hand with HTML. Okay, and it's called CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So, as usual, with these 3-letter acronyms, what you want to get out of this is pretty much one word, in this case 2 words. So, in IDE, you want to get the E, which is environment. HTML, you want to get that markup language, text markup language, right, TML. And in CSS, you want to get these last 2, which is style and sheets. We're actually going to create a style sheet, pretty much a sheet. Think of a sheet of paper, right? And imagine that that sheet of paper has styles written on it. Those styles will then get applied to our HTML skeleton. So that's the general idea of CSS. So we can do a lot, and I mean a lot of things with CSS. We can pretty much change everything about our website just using CSS. It's a very, very powerful language. So some of the things, a very small list of things you can do is change the font. You can change the text color, you can change the text size, which would actually be the font size. You can change how the font looks. You can make it bold, italic, underlined, overlined, make it smaller, bigger, change the color, change its style. All these different things can be done with CSS. Now, all of these things can be done in normal HTML, but when you do it in CSS, it really makes things a lot easier. And we're going to talk about that probably in the CSS video. CSS also allows you to add padding, margins, and change the default styling of all the components on your web page, meaning those header tags that we mentioned before don't have to be H1s are the biggest. We could make H2s the biggest using CSS, which is really, really quite cool. So we're going to get into padding, margins, all that kind of stuff, font changing, text size, all that, probably in a CSS specific video later on down the road. So don't worry too much about that now. I just want to make you aware of what CSS is. So, primarily, you can style your web page in 3 different ways using CSS syntax. So there's inline, embedded, and external. So if you're confused and you want to know what those are, go to the Test 01 webpage for examples. And this is actually the site to go to. You're going to go here, and you're going to go over to the CSS page. So if you want, you can pause this video and type in this link. And once you've done that, you can go to the CSS page and read all about inline, embedded, and external styling. We're going to talk about that in a CSS specific video, but just read up on that so you're not quite as confused when we get to that point. Alright, great job everyone. You made it through your very first PyCrafters recap session. Not too long, it's about 15 minutes. Relatively short actually. Most of our recap sessions may be that long, maybe a bit longer. We covered a lot of material in that recap session. If you watch this video, you can probably see why I recommend you come to the in-person class. I covered a lot of stuff, pretty much just read from my slides. Maybe I went into a little bit of detail, not too much. Okay, we go into a lot more detail, and we spend about an hour total talking about that entire slideshow in the class. So if you're confused, that's probably because you weren't at the class. Hopefully I cleared up a lot of confusion. If you still have questions, Join the Slack channel that I'm always recommending, sent you in the email, and definitely ask me questions in Slack. Well, that is it for today. I'm going to be releasing the next recap session video soon, and that will be covering a lot more HTML tags. I'm also going to be releasing a CSS specific video in the near future. I'm not quite sure when, probably after the next video. And that's going to talk about a lot of the stuff we mentioned in the last half of this video. And it's going to really get into a bit more of an in-depth explanation of what CSS is. Okay, good luck. Hopefully you don't have too many questions. If you do, Slack is always available. And I look forward to hearing your questions and seeing you next class. See you later.